They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but what happens when the person who betrayed you is standing over you, watching you scrub their mess off the floor, while 100 people witnessed your humiliation? Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't violence or screaming, it's the quiet truth, delivered at exactly the right moment. I never imagined that at 64 years old, I'd be kneeling on my own kitchen floor, cleaning up food while my daughter-in-law stood above me like a queen watching her servant. But that Mother's Day changed everything, including my understanding of just how far some people will go to destroy the ones who threaten their carefully constructed lies. The crash of breaking ceramic against my kitchen tiles seemed to echo through the entire house, silencing every conversation in the crowded dining room. I stared down at the scattered remains of my dinner plate. The food I had spent all morning preparing now spread across the floor like evidence of my humiliation. But had started like any other family celebration, Mother's Day at my son Kevin's house, where I had lived for the past 4 years since my husband passed away. As usual, I had been up since dawn preparing the feast while my daughter-in-law Victoria slept in, then emerged around noon, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread. I hope you didn't oversalt the roast like last time," she had said without so much as a good morning. My book club ladies have very sophisticated palates. I had swallowed the insult and continued cooking. 4 years of living under Victoria's roof had taught me that responding only made things worse. Kevin worked such long hours at his law firm that he rarely witnessed these small cruelties, and when he did, Victoria had perfected the art of making them seem like loving concern for an aging mother who was getting forgetful. The guests had arrived at 2:00 sharp, 40 members of Victoria's various social circles, all eager to see her beautiful home and taste what they believed was her cooking. I remained invisible in the kitchen, my arthritic hands aching as I plated dish after dish while Victoria held court in the living room, accepting compliments for my work. "Victoria, you're such an amazing hostess," I heard Mrs. Patterson from the country club gush, "and this food smells absolutely divine. You're so talented." Victoria's laugh tinkled like wind chimes. "While I do try to make everything special for the people I love, when it came time to eat." I had finally allowed myself to sit down with my own plate. After 6 hours of cooking and serving, my feet were swollen and my back was screaming, but the moment I took my first bite, Victoria appeared behind me. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Her voice was loud enough that several nearby guests turned to stare. "I'm eating," I said, confused by the question. "Here, with my guests." Her tone was incredulous, as if I had suggested something obscene. "Eleanor, you know perfectly well that your place is in the kitchen." The words hit me like a physical blow. Several guests had stopped eating entirely, their faces showing mixtures of shock and uncomfortable pity. My heart began hammering so loudly, I was sure everyone could hear it. "Victoria, I just wanted to know." She cut me off, her voice rising. "I have tolerated your constant interference in my home for 4 years. I have put up with your outdated cooking methods, your cluttered bedroom, your inappropriate comments to my friends, but I will not have you embarrassing me in front of my guests." The dining room had gone completely silent. 40 pairs of eyes were fixed on us, some wide with shock, others looking away in second-hand embarrassment. I felt my face burn with shame. "Get up," Victoria commanded. "Go to the kitchen where you belong, you useless old woman." The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Useless old woman. Said in front of people I had known for years. People from my church, neighbors who had watched Kevin grow up, all of them now seeing me reduced to nothing more than an inconvenient burden. I stood slowly, my legs trembling with humiliation and rage. As I picked up my plate to carry it to the kitchen, Victoria stuck out her foot deliberately. It wasn't an accident, it was calculated, cruel, designed for maximum humiliation. I stumbled, and my plate went flying, crashing to the floor in an explosion of china and food. The sound seemed to reverberate through the house like a gunshot. "Look what you've done now," Victoria shrieked, as if the trip had been my fault. "Clean up this mess immediately." As I knelt on the cold kitchen floor, picking up fragments of broken plate while my dinner spread around me like garbage, something inside me crystallized. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet and cold, like steel forming under pressure. I had endured 4 years of this treatment, 4 years of being made to feel like a guest in what had once been my son's home, watching Victoria systematically isolate Kevin from his childhood friends and manipulate him with tears whenever he showed me any attention or affection. for years of watching her spend his money on designer clothes and luxury vacations while claiming they couldn't afford to help with my medical expenses, for years of being treated like hired help in exchange for a roof over my head. But, as I cleaned up the mess on my hands and knees while Victoria continued to berate me for the entertainment of her guests, I realized something Victoria didn't know, something that would change everything. In my bedroom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, was an envelope containing $35,000 in cash, money I had been saving for months to give to Kevin and Victoria as a surprise gift to help with their mortgage. Money I had scraped together from my small Social Security checks, from selling jewelry my late husband had given me, from every corner I could cut without them knowing. But that envelope wouldn't be the surprise Victoria received, because 3 weeks ago, I had discovered something that changed my understanding of who my daughter-in-law really was, something that would destroy the perfect life she had built on lies and manipulation, something she never suspected. I knew. As I finished cleaning the floor while the party continued around me as if nothing had happened, I made a decision. The time had come for Victoria to learn that underestimating a useless old woman was the biggest mistake she had ever made. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I am 64 years old. For the past 4 years, I have been living in my son Kevin's house, watching his wife systematically destroy everything good in his life while positioning herself as the perfect wife and daughter. In-law. Victoria Morrison came into Kevin's life like a beautiful storm. She was 28 when they met, 12 years younger than my son, with the kind of looks that stopped traffic and the kind of charm that made everyone want to be her friend. Kevin, who had always been shy and bookish, was completely captivated. They met at a charity fundraiser where Kevin was doing pro bono legal work. Victoria was there as a volunteer coordinator, looking stunning in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in a wedding that cost more than most people's houses. At first, I was happy for Kevin. After his divorce from Sarah 3 years earlier, a quiet, kind woman who worked as a teacher and loved my son deeply but couldn't give him the excitement he thought he wanted, Kevin had been lonely. Victoria seemed to breathe new life into him. But almost immediately after the wedding, things began to change. Kevin started missing our weekly dinners, claiming Victoria needed him for various social obligations. He stopped calling as frequently, and when he did, Victoria was often in the background, making comments about how he needed to focus on his new family now. When my husband Harold died of a stroke 2 years into Kevin's marriage, I expected my son to help me navigate the difficult transition to widowhood. Instead, it was Victoria who suggested I sell my house and move in with them. "It makes perfect financial sense," she told Kevin during the funeral reception, while I was still reeling from grief. "The house is way too big for her now, and frankly, Eleanor shouldn't be living alone at her age. She's starting to seem a bit confused. I was 60 years old and had been managing my own household and finances for 4 decades, but Victoria had already begun planting seeds of doubt about my competence. Moving into their house was presented as a generous gesture, a loving daughter-in-law, taking care of her aging mother. The reality was quite different. From the first day, Victoria made it clear that I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My furniture was relegated to one small bedroom. My belongings were boxed up and stored in the garage because they didn't match the car. My cooking was constantly criticized as too heavy, too bland, or inappropriate for Victoria's sophisticated friends. "Eleanor, I know you mean well," Victoria would say with that sweet smile she perfected for public consumption, "but things are different now. This isn't the 1980s anymore." Kevin, exhausted from working 60-hour weeks to pay for Victoria's lifestyle, rarely noticed the subtle ways his wife undermined and humiliated me. When he did witness something that seemed unkind, Victoria had perfected the art of making it seem like loving concern. "I'm just worried about your mother, honey," she would tell him later. "She's getting more confused lately. Yesterday she put salt in her coffee instead of sugar. I think we need to start thinking about her long-term care." I hadn't put salt in my coffee. That was a lie, like so many others Victoria told to create a narrative of my incompetence. But Kevin, who desperately wanted to believe his beautiful wife was as good as she appeared, chose to trust her version of events over his own mother's. The financial abuse started gradually. Victoria would suggest that since I was living in their house rent-free, I should contribute to household expenses. Fair enough, except that my contributions kept increasing, while my influence over any household decisions disappeared entirely. She convinced Kevin that I should pay for groceries since I ate so much and did most of the cooking. She suggested I cover the increased utility bills since I was home all day. Eventually, I was paying nearly $1,200 per month, almost my entire Social Security check, while being treated like an unwelcomed boarder. But I endured it because I loved my son, and because I believed Victoria when she said Kevin was happier than he'd ever been. I told myself that my discomfort was a small price to pay for his happiness. That began to change 6 months ago when I started paying closer attention to Victoria's behavior. Small things at first, phone calls she would end abruptly when I entered the room, shopping trips that seemed to take much longer than necessary, unexplained charges on credit card statements that I glimpsed while helping Kevin organize his office. The breakthrough came 3 weeks before Mother's Day. During one of Victoria's book club meetings, she claimed to host a literature discussion group every Tuesday evening, but I noticed that the same luxury cars appeared in the driveway each week, and the women who emerged never seemed to carry any books. Curiosity got the better of me. One Tuesday, when Victoria was running late getting ready, I decided to do something I had never done before. I listened at the door. What I heard made my blood run cold. It wasn't a book club at all. It was a wives' strategy session, where Victoria and 4 other women shared techniques for controlling their wealthy husbands and maximizing their divorce settlements. The key is documentation. Victoria was saying, I've been building a file on Kevin's mother for 2 years now. Confused behavior, inappropriate outbursts, signs of dementia. When the time comes for divorce, I'll claim Kevin is too emotionally compromised by caring for his sick mother to make rational financial decisions. Another voice chimed in, brilliant, and the elder abuse angle gives you leverage too. You can claim you've been sacrificing your own well-being to care for her. Exactly, Victoria replied. Plus, I've been very careful about our finances. Kevin thinks we're living paycheck to paycheck because of his mother's medical expenses. But I've actually been moving money into offshore accounts he doesn't know about. By the time I file for divorce, I'll have hidden almost $500,000. I pressed my ear closer to the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they would hear it. What about the prenup? Someone asked. Victoria laughed, and the sound was like ice crystals forming. What prenup? I convinced him that asking for one would mean he didn't trust me. Poor Kevin was so worried about seeming unromantic that he never brought it up again. And his mother, won't she be a problem during the divorce? Not if she's in a nursing home, Victoria replied casually. I've already found one that takes Medicaid patients. The waiting list is 6 months, which gives me time to establish her mental incompetence. Kevin will be so relieved to have the burden lifted that he won't fight me on anything. I stumbled away from the door in shock. For 2 years, I had blamed myself for the tension in the house. I had believed Victoria's subtle suggestions that I was becoming a burden, that my age was making me difficult and confused. But it was all calculated. Every cruel comment, every humiliation, every instance of being made to feel unwelcome in my son's home was part of an elaborate plan to destroy our family for financial gain. That night, I lay awake planning my response. Victoria had underestimated 2 crucial things: my mental acuity and my determination to protect my son. If she wanted to play games with documentation and evidence, she was about to discover that a confused old woman could be far more dangerous than she imagined. The next morning, while Victoria was at her yoga class, I called my old friend, Margaret Chen, who had worked as a private investigator before retiring. Margaret had helped me verify Harold's insurance policies after his death, and I trusted her discretion completely. Eleanor, are you sure you want to go down this road? Margaret asked after I explained the situation. Once you start digging into someone's past, you might find things you weren't expecting. I'm sure, I replied. My son is about to be destroyed by someone who sees him as nothing more than a paycheck. I need to know who Victoria Morrison really is. Margaret's investigation took 2 weeks, and the results were far worse than I had imagined. Victoria Morrison was not her real name. She was actually Vivian Marsh, and she had been married twice before, both times to wealthy older men who had died under suspicious circumstances. Her first husband, Robert Chen, had been a 65-year-old real estate developer in Phoenix. He died of an apparent heart attack 6 months after changing his will to leave everything to his young wife. The insurance company had investigated but found no evidence of foul play. Her second husband, Michael Torres, had been a 58-year-old investment banker in Denver. He died in what appeared to be a hiking accident 8 months after their wedding. Again, the insurance investigation found nothing conclusive, but the timing was suspiciously convenient. In both cases, Vivian had inherited substantial sums of money that she had quickly transferred offshore before disappearing and reinventing herself under a new identity. Kevin was not her third victim. He was her third target, chosen for his wealth, his loneliness after his divorce, and his trusting nature. But Margaret had found something else, something that would give me the leverage I needed. Vivian's second marriage had never been legally dissolved. Michael Torres' death was still under review by the insurance company, and his estate had not been fully settled. Technically, Victoria's marriage to Kevin was bigamous, and therefore invalid. Moreover, Margaret had discovered evidence that Victoria had been systematically draining Kevin's accounts through forged documents and identity theft. She had opened credit cards in his name, taken out loans using his excellent credit, and moved money through a complex network designed to hide her theft. The evidence was damning, but I knew I had to be strategic about how I used it. Victoria was smart and ruthless, and if she suspected I was onto her, she might accelerate her timeline or find ways to discredit me before I could act. I decided to wait for the perfect moment, a moment when Victoria felt completely in control and confident in her power over our family. Mother's Day seemed appropriate, given how thoroughly she had corrupted what should have been a celebration of family love. As the party planning progressed and Victoria assigned me more and more of the cooking and cleaning, while taking credit for everything, I carefully documented each slight, each moment of abuse, each example of her treating me like hired help while playing the loving daughter-in-law for her guests. The night before Mother's Day, I prepared 2 envelopes. One contained the $35,000 I had originally intended to give them as a gift. The other contained copies of Margaret's investigation, proof of Victoria's real identity, evidence of her bigamous marriage, and documentation of her financial crimes. By the time Victoria forced me to my knees to clean up that broken plate, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The humiliation she thought would break me was actually the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy her completely. As I knelt on that kitchen floor, listening to her continue berating me while her 40 guests watched in uncomfortable silence, I smiled for the first time in months. Victoria had no idea that she had just given me the perfect stage for her downfall. After I finished cleaning the floor, I remained in the kitchen as instructed, letting Victoria bask in the sympathy of her guests. I could hear fragments of conversation from the dining room, expressions of concern for poor Victoria, who was clearly struggling with a difficult mother-in-law situation. "She's been so patient with Eleanor," I heard Mrs. Patterson say. "I don't know how she does it. It must be so hard," another voice agreed. "Having to take care of someone who's clearly becoming unmanageable." Victoria's response was perfectly calibrated. "I just try to remember that it's not her fault. Age can be so cruel. Kevin and I are looking into some wonderful facilities that specialize in memory care." Memory care, the final insult, delivered while I was close enough to hear every word. Victoria was already laying the groundwork for having me declared incompetent and institutionalized. But as the afternoon wore on and Victoria's confidence grew, I noticed something she had missed in her careful orchestration of my humiliation. Several of the guests, people who had known me for years, seemed uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, but Mrs. Martinez from my church kept glancing toward the kitchen with a troubled expression. Dr. Patel, who had been Harold's physician and knew me well, was frowning at something Victoria had said about my supposed memory problems. Most importantly, Kevin had been unusually quiet since the incident. When I risked a peek into the dining room, I saw him sitting at the head of the table with a strange expression on his face, as if he were seeing something clearly for the first time. Around 4 o'clock, as the party began winding down, I made my move. I emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver tray with coffee service, playing the role of the dutiful servant Victoria had cast me in. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough to reach everyone in the dining room. "Victoria, I have something for you." She looked up from her conversation with a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "Eleanor, I thought I told you to stay in the kitchen until the guests left." "I know," I replied, moving to stand beside her chair, "but this couldn't wait." I reached into my apron pocket and withdrew the 2 envelopes I had prepared. The first one, containing the $35,000, I placed on the table beside Victoria's wine glass. "This is the gift I had planned to give you and Kevin today," I said, my voice clear and steady. $35,000 I saved to help with your mortgage, because I wanted to show my appreciation for letting me live in your home. A murmur of surprise went through the room. Victoria's eyes widened as she stared at the thick envelope, clearly not expecting this development. But after this afternoon, I continued, I realized you deserve something different, something more appropriate. I placed the second envelope on the table. This one was thinner, but the weight of its contents would be far more devastating than any amount of money. What is this? Victoria asked, but there was something in her voice that suggested she already suspected her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Why don't you open it? I suggested, in front of all your friends. I think they'll find it very interesting. The dining room had gone completely silent again, but this time the attention wasn't on my humiliation. It was focused entirely on Victoria's reaction as she opened the envelope with trembling hands. The first document she saw was a copy of her marriage certificate to Michael Torres, dated just 3 years before her wedding to Kevin. Her face went completely white as she stared at the proof that her current marriage was invalid. Where did you get this? She whispered, but her voice was no longer the confident, commanding tone she had used all afternoon. Keep looking, I said calmly. There's much more. With shaking fingers, Victoria pulled out the next document, Margaret's investigative report, detailing her real identity as Vivian Marsh, complete with photographs and documentation of her 2 previous marriages to wealthy men who had died suspiciously. Guests had begun moving closer to see what was happening. Dr. Patel took the liberty of looking over Victoria's shoulder, his medical training making him naturally curious about anything that could cause such a dramatic physical reaction. My God, he muttered as he saw the contents. These are police reports. Victoria tried to grab the papers away from him, but her coordination seemed to have deserted her completely. The documents scattered across the table where other guests could see them clearly. Victoria, Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. What is all this? But Victoria couldn't answer. She was staring at the final item in the envelope, a copy of the bank transfer records showing how she had systematically stolen nearly $800,000 from Kevin's accounts over the past 3 years. The silence in the dining room was absolute. 40 people stared at the evidence of fraud, bigamy, and potentially murder spread across the Mother's Day table where they had just shared a meal. Victoria tried one last desperate gambit. She looked around the room with tears streaming down her face, playing the victim role she had perfected over years of manipulation. This is all fabricated, she said, her voice breaking convincingly. Eleanor has been becoming increasingly paranoid and delusional. She's been accusing me of terrible things for months. Kevin, you know how confused she's been getting. But this time, the performance didn't work. Too many people had seen too much evidence to dismiss it as the ravings of a confused old woman. Dr. Patel, who had been examining the documents, looked up with a grim expression. Mrs. Hartwell, these appear to be legitimate police reports and financial records. Where exactly did you obtain them? From a licensed private investigator, I replied. Margaret Chen, who worked with the district attorney's office for 30 years before retiring. Everything in that envelope has been verified and documented. Kevin finally found his voice. Victoria, is any of this true? Victoria looked around the room desperately, seeking an ally or at least a sympathetic face. But the 40 people who had come to celebrate Mother's Day were now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Mrs. Patterson, who had been gushing about Victoria's hospitality just hours earlier, was backing away from the table as if Victoria were contagious. I think we should go, someone said quietly, and suddenly there was a general movement toward the door as guests hurried to distance themselves from the scandal they had just witnessed. Within 10 minutes, the dining room was empty, except for Kevin, Victoria, and me. The silence was deafening, but Victoria made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. She turned to Kevin with that manipulative sweetness she had used to control him for 4 years. Kevin, honey, you can't believe this. Your mother has been getting worse and worse. She's been making up stories, becoming paranoid. This is clearly some kind of elaborate delusion. You know how much I love you, how much I've sacrificed to take care of your mother. But Kevin was reading through the bank records, his face growing paler with each page. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, a cold clarity that showed he was finally seeing his wife for who she really was. These bank transfers, he said quietly. I remember signing these documents. You told me they were for refinancing the mortgage. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, But Kevin held up his hand to stop her. And this investment account, he continued. You said it was a joint account for our retirement, but according to this, you're the only name on it. Kevin, I can explain. No, he said firmly. You can't explain, because there's no explanation that makes this anything other than theft. He stood up slowly, still holding the financial documents. My mother just handed you $35,000 in cash as a gift. Money she saved from her Social Security checks to help us with our mortgage, while you were systematically stealing everything I'd worked for my entire adult life. Victoria began crying again, but this time the tears looked genuinely desperate rather than calculated. Kevin, please, I love you. Everything I did for us. You did it for yourself, I said quietly, just like you did with Robert Chen and Michael Torres. The mention of her previous victims' names hit Victoria like a physical blow. She collapsed into her chair, all pretense of innocence finally abandoned. How long have you known? Kevin asked me. 3 weeks, I admitted, ever since I overheard one of her book club meetings where she was planning your divorce and discussing how to have me declared incompetent so she could steal everything without interference. Kevin's face went through a series of expressions: shock, betrayal, rage, and finally a kind of grim acceptance. He looked at Victoria with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with such obvious disgust. Pack your things, he told her. You have 1 hour. After that, I'm calling the police. Kevin, you can't. I can and I will, he said with finality. You're not my wife. You were never my wife. Your marriage to Michael Torres was never dissolved, which makes our marriage invalid. You're nothing but a con artist who targeted me for my money. Victoria tried one last manipulation tactic, turning to me with desperation. Eleanor, please, you're a good Christian woman. You believe in forgiveness. Help me make Kevin understand. I looked at this woman who had spent 4 years systematically destroying my relationship with my son, who had humiliated me in front of 40 people just hours earlier, who had been planning to have me institutionalized as part of her scheme to rob my family blind. I do believe in forgiveness, I said calmly, but I also believe in justice, and justice means that my son finally knows the truth about who you really are. The hour that followed was surreal. Victoria packed frantically, alternating between tears and rage, occasionally trying to grab valuables that didn't belong to her. Kevin watched her with cold efficiency, documenting everything she took to ensure it was legitimately hers. When the police arrived, Victoria was still trying to convince them that I had fabricated everything as part of some elaborate fantasy, but Margaret's documentation was thorough and professional, and the officers quickly realized they were dealing with a sophisticated fraud case rather than family drama. As they led Victoria away in handcuffs, she looked back at me with pure hatred. This isn't over, you old witch, she hissed. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. But I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in 4 years, I felt completely safe in my son's house. That night, after the police had finished taking statements and the house was finally quiet, Kevin and I sat in the living room together. The silence wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was peaceful. The first real peace we had shared since Victoria entered our lives. Mom, Kevin finally said, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I started to protest, but he held up his hand. No, please let me say this. For 4 years, I watched that woman treat you terribly. I saw her make you feel unwelcome in what should have been your home. I heard her talk about you like you were a burden instead of my mother who raised me alone. After Dad died when I was 12, his voice broke slightly. And I let her do it because it was easier to believe her lies than to face the possibility that I had married someone who was using me. Kevin, I chose her over you, he continued. Every time there was a conflict, every time she said you were being difficult or confused, I took her side. I let her isolate me from my childhood friends, from the life I had before her. And worst of all, I let her make you feel like you didn't belong in our family anymore. Tears were streaming down his face now, and I could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. Can you forgive me? He asked. Because I don't know how I can forgive myself for being so stupid and blind. I moved to sit beside him on the couch, taking his hands in mine the way I had when he was a little boy and needed comfort. There's nothing to forgive, I said. Victoria was very skilled at manipulation. She made both of us doubt ourselves, doubt each other, doubt what we were seeing with our own eyes. But you saw through her eventually. Why didn't I? Because you loved her, I said simply. Or you thought you did. Love makes us vulnerable to people who know how to exploit it. We sat together in the quiet house, processing the wreckage of the past 4 years and beginning to understand how much rebuilding we would need to do. What happens now? Kevin asked. Now, we heal, I replied. We remember what it means to be a family again, and we make sure Victoria never has the chance to hurt anyone else the way she hurt us. The legal proceedings took 8 months. Victoria, or Vivian, as we now knew her real name, was charged with bigamy, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The evidence Margaret had gathered, combined with the financial records Kevin's attorneys uncovered, painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning more than a decade. During the investigation, we learned the full scope of her crimes. She had stolen not just from Kevin, but from numerous other victims across the country. The FBI estimated that her various schemes had netted her over $2 million. Most shocking of all, the investigation into her previous husband's deaths was reopened based on the pattern of behavior Margaret had documented. While murder charges were never filed, both cases were reclassified as suspicious deaths, requiring further investigation. Victoria eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. At her sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to speak about the impact her crimes had on our family. "You didn't just steal money," I told her as she sat in her orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the designer clothes she had once worn. "You stole 4 years of my relationship with my son. You stole his ability to trust. You stole our sense of security and family unity." She stared at me with the same cold hatred she had shown the day of her arrest, but her power to hurt us was finally broken. "But you also gave us something valuable," I continued. "You taught us to appreciate what we have, to value honesty over appearances, and to never again take our family bonds for granted." After the sentencing, Kevin and I began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship. He insisted on reimbursing me for the 4 years of excessive household expenses Victoria had manipulated me into paying. He also established a trust fund to ensure I would never again be financially vulnerable to anyone who might try to exploit me. More importantly, we began talking honestly about the years of manipulation and emotional abuse we had both endured. Kevin enrolled in therapy to understand how he had been so completely deceived, while I worked with a counselor to process the trauma of being systematically devalued and humiliated in my own family. The house felt different without Victoria's presence. The tension that had permeated every room gradually dissipated, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of a family learning to be themselves again. Kevin started cooking again, something Victoria had discouraged because it interfered with her carefully curated image of domestic perfection. We began having friends over for simple dinners, something that had been impossible under Victoria's regime of constant entertaining and social climbing. Most importantly, Kevin began dating again, but this time, he insisted on my approval before any relationship became serious. We had learned our lesson about the importance of family unity and communication. "I will never again ignore your instincts about someone," he promised me. "If you don't trust someone I'm seeing, I need to understand why." 2 years after Victoria's arrest, Kevin met Jennifer, a widow his own age with 2 teenage children. She was nothing like Victoria. Practical instead of glamorous, genuine instead of manipulative, interested in Kevin's character rather than his bank account. The first time Jennifer came to dinner, she insisted on helping me cook and clean up afterward, treating me as an equal partner in the household rather than hired help. When she complimented the meal, she made sure to acknowledge that I had prepared it, something Victoria had never done in 4 years. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jennifer said, as we washed dishes together, "Kevin told me what happened with his ex. I want you to know that I completely respect the place you have in his life and in this home." "Call me Eleanor," I said, feeling tears of gratitude in my eyes, "and you're welcome here anytime." 3 years after that terrible Mother's Day, Kevin and Jennifer were married in a small ceremony in our backyard. This time, Kevin asked me to walk him down the aisle, publicly acknowledging the role I had played in raising him and the importance of my approval in his new marriage. "You saved my life," he told me as we walked together toward his new beginning. "If you hadn't exposed Victoria when you did, she would have destroyed everything I worked for and then disappeared, leaving both of us with nothing." Now, 5 years later, I sit in the same kitchen where Victoria once forced me to clean up broken dishes while her guests watched in uncomfortable silence. But everything has changed. The kitchen is filled with the laughter of Jennifer's children, who call me Grandma Eleanor and actually mean it. The dining room where I was once humiliated now hosts weekly family dinners where everyone contributes to the cooking and conversation, where my opinions are valued and my presence is celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Sometimes I think about Victoria, serving her sentence in a federal prison somewhere, and I feel something that might be pity. She had everything: a loving husband, a comfortable home, a family that would have welcomed her if she had been genuine, but she threw it all away for money she couldn't take with her and power that ultimately consumed her. The $35,000 I had planned to give her as a gift was eventually donated to a charity that helps elderly victims of financial abuse. It seemed fitting that money intended to show love and appreciation went instead to protecting other seniors from the kind of predator Victoria had been. The most important lesson I learned from those terrible years is that family loyalty should never come at the expense of truth. I spent 4 years enabling Victoria's abuse because I thought protecting Kevin's happiness meant staying silent about his wife's cruelty. But real love sometimes requires difficult conversations and painful revelations. If I had spoken up sooner, if I had trusted my instincts instead of doubting myself when Victoria made me feel crazy and paranoid, we might have avoided years of manipulation and financial theft. I also learned that age and vulnerability don't make you powerless. Victoria saw me as an easy target, an elderly woman dependent on her son's generosity, with no resources to fight back against her schemes. She underestimated the strength that comes from desperation, and the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. Most importantly, I learned that the truth is the most powerful weapon against people who build their lives on lies. Victoria's entire existence was constructed on deception, manipulation, and the careful cultivation of false images. When confronted with documented evidence of who she really was, her elaborate facade collapsed completely. Today, as I watch Kevin and Jennifer build a genuine marriage based on honesty and mutual respect, as I help raise their children with love instead of manipulation, as I sit in my own home where I'm valued as a family member rather than tolerated as a burden, I know that the pain of those 4 years was worth the peace we have now. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to be silent in the face of abuse. Sometimes protecting the people you love means exposing the predators who are destroying them, even when those predators have convinced everyone that you're the problem. Victoria taught me that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like beautiful women in designer clothes who know exactly how to smile and say the right words to get what they want. But she also taught me that even the most sophisticated predator can be brought down by a patient, determined victim who refuses to give up. That Mother's Day, when she forced me to my knees to clean up broken china while her guests watched in silence, Victoria thought she had finally broken me completely. What she didn't realize was that she had actually given me the final piece of motivation I needed to destroy her. The humiliation she thought would silence me forever became the catalyst for her downfall. The useless old woman she dismissed as beneath her notice became the architect of her destruction. And now, every Mother's Day since, when Kevin and Jennifer and the children gather around our table to celebrate family and love and the bonds that hold us together, I remember that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it hurts, even when it changes everything, even when it means watching their world fall apart so it can be rebuilt on something real. Did you like my story? And which city are you watching from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.